on a night in 1943, when the moon over Monte Cassino was bright enough to turn the pale stone ruins almost white. Bright enough that every broken wall threw a hard, clean shadow across the rubble, and every soldier on that hill had his own shadow stretching long behind him on the ground. 4 figures in hooded robes walked through the wreckage of the bombed abbey in single file and left nothing behind them on the pale ground at all. A soldier watching from one side of the battle line pressed himself into the rubble and did not fire, and wrote down what he saw in a report that nobody read for the better part of 40 years. A soldier on the other side of the same battle line, wearing a different uniform, speaking a different language, fighting for a different cause, watched the same 4 figures on the same night and also held his fire, and also wrote it down, and also filed it somewhere it would not be found, until a researcher in Rome placed both documents on the same table in 1987 and understood immediately that she was looking at something without a comfortable explanation. Same hill, same night, same 4 shadowless figures, and 2 men who never met describing the same impossible detail, with the same quiet precision across 4 decades and 2 languages. What were they? That is the only question this story has ever asked, and it has never been answered in any way that fully holds. Before the war came to Monte Cassino, something else had already been there for 14 centuries. In the year 529 AD, a monk named Benedict of Nursia climbed a limestone mountain in central Italy, looked out over the valley below, and decided that this was the place. Not because it was comfortable, not because it was safe or accessible or close to anything a reasonable person would call civilization. He chose it because it was high and isolated, and the kind of place where the noise of the world below could not easily follow a man who was trying to listen for something quieter. He built his abbey on the summit, and he died there. And after he died, his monks buried him beneath the altar and kept praying. And other monks came, and the abbey grew, and the centuries began to accumulate the way centuries do in places that refuse to be abandoned. What accumulated alongside the prayers was something else as well. Because Monte Cassino was not simply a place of devotion. It was a place that the world kept finding. And the world in those 14 centuries was frequently at war with itself. The Lombards sacked the abbey in 589 AD, 60 years after Benedict built it, and burned it to the ground. The monks rebuilt it. The Saracens destroyed it again in 883 AD, and the monks rebuilt it again. The Normans came. The earthquakes came. Napoleon's army came in 1799 and looted what they could carry and left the rest in disorder. Through every destruction and every rebuilding, the monks stayed or returned, and the dead accumulated in the ground beneath the abbey walls. Layer upon layer, in century upon century, soldiers and pilgrims and monks and the victims of 1400 years of violence on a hill that the world could not seem to leave alone. By the time the Second World War arrived at Monte Cassino in the winter of 1943, the ground beneath that abbey had been holding its dead for longer than most nations had existed. The Allied commanders who ordered the bombing on February 15, 1944, would argue for the rest of their lives that it was a military necessity, that the Germans were using the ancient structure as an observation post, that the cost of taking the mountain without destroying the building would have been measured in thousands of additional lives. The German commanders would counter that no German soldiers had been stationed inside the abbey itself, that the building was being deliberately respected as a sacred site, and that the bombing achieved nothing tactically except the creation of rubble that proved far easier to defend than the intact structure had been. Both arguments contain truth, and neither argument is the point. The point is that on February 15, 1944, 14 centuries of continuous human habitation, prayer, Burial, violence, rebuilding, and accumulated silence were reduced to pale, broken stone in a matter of hours. And the question of what that kind of destruction does to a place that old, to the things a place that old might be holding inside it, is a question that military after-action reports were never designed to answer. The soldiers who came to Monte Cassino after the bombing arrived at a ruin. What some of them found there was something the ruin had apparently been keeping for a very long time. What they found begins with one man on one side of the war, a German soldier, a veteran, someone who had earned, at considerable cost, the right to trust his own eyes. Dieter Schramm was not a man who frightened easily, and the record bears that out. By the autumn of 1943, when his unit was posted to the defensive fortifications at Monte Cassino as part of the German Winter Line, Schramm had already survived 2 years on the Eastern Front. He had fought at Kursk. He had watched entire companies disappear into the Russian winter and had come out the other side of it with his mind intact and his instincts sharp and his capacity for self-deception reduced to almost nothing, because the Eastern Front had a way of burning that particular weakness out of a man very quickly. You learned to see what was in front of you clearly, without the softening that fear or hope could add, because your survival depended on the accuracy of your perception. He was 31 years old. He held the rank of Oberfeldwebel, a senior sergeant, which meant that other men relied on his judgment. He had not, in 2 years of the most brutal land warfare of the 20th century, filed a single report that his commanding officers had reason to question. The report he filed in November of 1943 was the exception. It was a routine night patrol through the Abbey grounds, himself and a younger soldier named Brandt, a Bavarian 19-year-old who had been at the front for less than 4 months and who Schramm had taken quietly under his care, in the way that experienced soldiers sometimes do with the young ones. Not from sentimentality, but from the practical understanding that a frightened and inexperienced soldier next to you is a liability you cannot afford. The night was cold and had rained earlier, leaving the courtyard mud-soft and receptive, the kind of ground that holds a footprint cleanly. Schramm noted this detail in his report because he was the kind of man who noted details, the same way he noted that there was no moon yet when they entered the courtyard, that the wind was coming from the northwest at a consistent and noticeable strength, that visibility was limited but adequate for the patrol's purpose. They were halfway across the courtyard when Brandt stopped walking and put his hand out sideways without a word. Schramm stopped. He followed Brandt's eye line. 4 figures in hooded robes were moving along the far side of the courtyard in single file, moving slowly, moving with the particular unhurried deliberateness of men who are engaged in something they have done 10,000 times before and expect to do 10,000 times again. Their robes were long and dark, and their hoods were drawn forward so that no face was visible from where Schramm and Brandt were standing. Schramm's first thought was that they were monks, that some small number of the Abbey's religious community had remained despite the military occupation of the surrounding area, that this was exactly what it appeared to be. Then he noticed the wind. The figures were moving against it, not struggling against it the way a man struggles against a strong wind, leaning into it, adjusting his weight. They were simply moving in the direction the wind was coming from, and their robes were not moving at all. The long dark fabric hung completely still around them, as though the wind were not there, as though the wind did not know they were there, as though whatever relationship these figures had with the physical world around them did not include the obligation to be affected by it. Brandt made a sound beside him. Very quiet. Not a word. Just a sound. The kind a person makes when something they are looking at is reorganizing their understanding of what is possible. Schramm put his hand on Brandt's arm. He could feel the younger man trembling beneath his grip, and he tightened his hold because a trembling hand next to a weapon is a situation that needs to be managed before it becomes something irreversible. Hold. Do not fire. Brandt did not fire, but his free hand found the small crucifix he wore beneath his uniform collar, and he pulled it out and held it. And slowly, without taking his eyes off the figures, he dropped to one knee on the wet ground of the courtyard. Schramm led him. There are moments when what a man needs is not discipline, but the thing that lives underneath discipline, and he recognized this as one of those moments. He looked back at the figures. They had not reacted to either man. They had not slowed or quickened their pace. They had not turned toward the sound of Schramm's voice or toward the soft noise of Brandt's knee finding the mud. They moved with the complete indifference of something that either could not perceive the two soldiers standing 30 feet away, or had perceived them and found them entirely irrelevant. And Schramm could not determine which of those possibilities disturbed him more. He watched them until they were gone, and then he stood in the wet courtyard for a moment that he did not record the duration of, which for a man as precise as Schramm was itself a kind of notation. Then he looked down at the mud where the figures had walked. There were no footprints. The same soft ground that had been receiving and holding every boot print since the rain stopped. The ground that was recording his own position and Brandt's position with perfect fidelity showed nothing where the four figures had passed. Not a compression, not a smear, nothing. He looked at Brandt, who was still on one knee, still holding his crucifix, still looking at the place where the figures had been. "Get up. We finished the patrol." Brandt asked his question the way a child asks, without any expectation that the answer would be comfortable. "What were they?" "I don't know. Get up." They finished the patrol without speaking. Schramm filed his report the following morning, recording every detail with the same precision he brought to every report he had ever written. The time, the location, the weather conditions, the direction of the wind, the absence of footprints, the absence of shadows when the moon finally rose and lit the courtyard, in the hour before they returned to their position. He recorded Brandt's reaction and his own. He recorded the detail about the robes not moving in the wind. He recorded everything. His commanding officer read it, wrote 4 words in the margin in blue ink, and filed it away. The 4 words were fatigue, poor visibility, noted. Schramm never mentioned it again. But the researcher who found that report in Munich in 1987 noted something that the commanding officer's dismissal had never addressed. Something that Schramm had recorded at the bottom of his account, in the careful handwriting of a man, making sure the detail was not lost. In fresh mud, after rain, on a night when every boot left a clean impression, 4 figures had walked across a courtyard and left the ground beneath them completely undisturbed. Fatigue does not explain that. Poor visibility does not explain that. Nothing that Schramm's commanding officer wrote in that margin came anywhere close to explaining that. Before the American account begins, it is necessary to understand what Monte Cassino was doing to the men on both sides of the line that winter. Because one of the first arguments a reasonable person reaches for, when confronted with accounts like Schramm's, is the condition of the mind that produced them. There is a version of this story where everything that follows has a simple explanation. And that explanation is what the winter of 1943 and 1944 was doing to the human mind at Monte Cassino. Consider the conditions honestly before dismissing that possibility, because it deserves to be considered honestly. The soldiers on both sides of the line at Monte Cassino that winter were operating under a weight of sustained physical and psychological stress that most people living ordinary lives will never come close to understanding. The cold was not the cold of an uncomfortable winter. It was the kind of cold that kills men who stop moving, that turns wet boots into instruments of slow destruction, that makes the simple act of remaining functional a daily negotiation between the body and the will. Men on both sides of the line reported losing feeling in their feet for days at a time. Some of them lost more than feeling. The artillery never fully stopped. This is the detail that the history books record accurately but cannot fully convey, because recording the fact of continuous artillery and conveying what continuous artillery does to a mind over weeks and months are entirely different things. The human nervous system is not designed for that kind of sustained assault. After enough days of it, the brain begins to do things that it would not otherwise do. It fills silences with sounds. It populates shadows with movement. It reaches for pattern and meaning in places where there is only noise and destruction. Because pattern and meaning are what the mind uses to keep itself from coming apart at the seams. Add to this the starvation, the static warfare where men died in numbers for ground measured in meters. The particular psychological horror of a battle that seemed to have no forward momentum, no visible end, no logic that connected the cost to any conceivable gain. And you have the conditions under which a rational man might genuinely doubt what his own eyes were telling him. A medic who treated soldiers pulled from the casino line in early 1944 wrote in his field notes that the men coming off that mountain had a specific look that he had not seen before and hoped never to see again. They weren't shell-shocked in the way I had been trained to recognize. They were quieter than that. Like men who had seen something, they were still in the process of deciding whether to believe. That observation has stayed with researchers who have worked on this period because it describes something beyond battlefield trauma. It describes the particular stillness of a witness. And here is why none of what that winter did to those men explains the accounts of Schramm and Reedy away. Schramm filed his account before the worst of the winter had fully settled, when his unit was freshly posted and his mind was as sharp as it had ever been after 2 years of Eastern Front warfare. He recorded physical evidence, the absence of footprints in mud that was recording every other impression with complete fidelity, that exists independently of his psychological state. You cannot hallucinate the absence of footprints. Either they were there or they were not. And the mud that night was keeping an accurate record of everything else. Reedy's account comes with its own corroboration, and that account belongs to the next part of this story. But the medic's words are worth sitting with for a moment before moving there, because they describe something that both men share across the years and the languages and the uniforms that separated them. They were quieter than that. Like men who had seen something, they were still in the process of deciding whether to believe. Some of them never finished deciding. Some things resist the verdict. The American side of this story begins not with the Abbey itself, but with a river, and with one of the worst nights of the entire Italian campaign. James Reedy was 22 years old on the night of February 15, 1944, and he was in the worst place he had ever been in his life, which was saying something considerable given that he had been at the front for 7 months. The 36th Infantry Division's attempt to cross the Rapido River at Sant'Angelo that February is one of those episodes in military history that the official record describes in the clean language of tactical analysis, and that the men who survived it described in entirely different terms. The river was narrow but fast, running cold and high from the winter rains. The German defensive positions on the far bank had been prepared with the kind of thoroughness that months of static warfare allow. The boats the men were given were inadequate. The smoke cover failed. The timing failed. Nearly everything that could go wrong went wrong in the specific, sequential way that turns a difficult operation into a catastrophe. And the men who went into that river on that night went into it knowing, with the particular clarity that combat soldiers develop, that the numbers were not in their favor. Reedy made it across. Not many did. He made it across and lost his squad in the smoke and the noise and the confusion of the bank, and found himself alone in the rubble on the lower slopes of the casino hill, pressed against a broken wall with his rifle across his knees, doing the arithmetic that a separated soldier does in the dark, calculating distance and direction and the location of sounds, trying to build a picture of where he was relative to where he needed to be. He was still doing that arithmetic when the bombing started above him. The Allied air assault on the Monte Cassino Abbey began on the morning of February 15th, and what Reedy was witnessing from the lower slopes was the tail end of that destruction. The fires still burning in the ruins on the heights above him, the smoke rising into a sky that was simultaneously lit by moonlight and by the orange glow of what had been, until that morning, a 1,400-year-old building. He told the person he eventually gave this story to that he remembered thinking, in the strange, disconnected way the mind works under extreme stress, that he had never seen anything burn that old before. That there was something specific about the quality of the light coming off those ruins that was different from any fire he had seen in the war. And as though the building were releasing something it had been holding inside it for a very long time. He was watching the ruins on the heights above him when he saw the figures, 4 of them, moving through the rubble of the bombed abbey in single file. Hooded, their robes long and dark, moving with the slow and completely unhurried deliberateness of a procession. Not running, not ducking or pressing themselves against walls the way every living person on that hillside was doing. Simply walking, upright and measured, in single file through the burning ruins while artillery was still falling on the ridgelines to the east and the west. Reedy's first thought was that they were survivors. Monks who had been inside the building when the bombing began and had somehow come through it and were now moving through the wreckage in shock. Because shock does strange things to the body, and sometimes the strangest thing it does is produce a terrible calm, a slow and deliberate movement that looks from a distance like serenity, but is actually the nervous system operating on the last reserves of something that has no name in any field manual. He watched them and waited for one of them to fall, to stumble on the rubble, to reach out a hand and steady themselves against a broken wall, to do any of the things that a person moving through uneven debris in the dark does as a matter of simple physical necessity. None of them stumbled. None of them reached out. They moved through the rubble with the ease of men walking a path they had walked so many times that the ground itself had become an extension of their intention. And not one of them broke the line or altered the pace, or gave any indication that the destroyed landscape around them presented any difficulty at all. Then the moon came fully clear of the smoke. Reedy said that he felt the moment before he understood it. That something shifted in the quality of what he was looking at before his mind had found the words for what was wrong. The moonlight was falling on the pale stone ruins with the hard clarity of full winter moon on limestone, throwing sharp, defined shadows from every broken wall and every tumbled piece of masonry and every jagged edge of what had been the abbey's structure. Shadows so clean and definite that they looked almost painted on the pale ground. He looked at the 4 figures. He looked at the ground around the 4 figures. He looked back at the figures. There was nothing there. No shadows behind them, no shadows beneath them, no trace of darkness on the moonlit ground where 4 solid moving bodies should have been interrupting the light and leaving their mark on the pale stone beneath them. He told the person he gave this story to that he checked himself in that moment with the specific deliberateness of a man who understands that his own perception cannot be fully trusted under the conditions he was operating in. He looked at the broken wall to the left of the figures. Hard shadow. He looked at a piece of timber lying in the rubble. Hard shadow. He looked at his own hand, where it rested on the stock of his rifle. and held it out slightly from the wall he was pressed against. Hard shadow. He looked back at the four figures moving in single file through the moonlit ruins and found nothing on the ground beneath them. He pressed himself against the rubble, and he watched them, and he did not fire, and he did not call out, and he did not move. He counted the time the way soldiers count things automatically, because the habit of timing had been built into him by months at the front. And the habit did not stop working simply because what he was looking at had stopped making sense. 3 minutes, he said. Approximately 3 minutes from the moment the moon came clear of the smoke to the moment the last figure moved behind a section of standing wall and did not come out the other side. He waited for them to come out the other side. They did not. He stayed pressed against his wall for a time he did not measure, and then a flare went up to the east, and the immediate tactical reality of his situation reasserted itself with the hard clarity that danger produces. And he began moving carefully in the direction of the Allied line. He told no one that night. He told no one the next day, or the week after, or in the months of the Italian campaign that followed, or in the years after the war when he came home to Texas and built a life and raised children and became, by every external measure, a man who had put the war behind him. He told one person in a veterans hospital in the spring of 1971, lying flat on his back with 3 weeks left to live, speaking quietly and carefully, and with the precision of a man who has been waiting a very long time to get something exactly right. I need you to understand something. I have thought about what those things could have been for 27 years. I have gone through every explanation a reasonable person can construct. Every single one of them fails on the shadows. You can explain away everything else if you work hard enough at it. But in full moonlight, on pale stone, when my own hand cast a shadow on the wall behind it, those four figures cast nothing. That is not something a tired mind invents. A tired mind invents things that are there. It does not uninvent things that should be. He paused for a moment and then said the rest of it. I just need someone to know that I saw it, that it was real, that I was not a man who lost his mind on an Italian hillside. He was not. The record, when it was finally assembled, would make that clear. 2 accounts, 2 men, 2 languages. The assembly of that record belongs to Rome, 1987, and to the woman who understood what she was looking at the moment both documents were on the same table. Her name was Dr. Elena Ferretti, and she was not looking for anything unusual when she found it. She was a military historian attached to a research institution in Rome, working on a comparative study of psychological records from both sides of the Italian campaign, specifically the documentation of combat stress and what the military bureaucracies of different nations chose to do with accounts that did not fit the categories they had been designed to process. It was academic work, methodical and unglamorous, the kind of research that requires years of archive access and produces papers read carefully by small numbers of people and ignored entirely by everyone else. She had been granted access to a collection of transferred Wehrmacht administrative records that had spent the post-war decades in a facility outside Munich before being cataloged and made available to academic researchers in the mid-1980s. Among those records, filed in a folder of miscellaneous non-tactical reports from the Monte Cassino sector, was Dieter Schramm's account. She read it twice. She noted the specific details. She noted the commanding officer's margin annotation and noted also what the margin annotation failed to address. She photographed the document, filed her own notation, and continued her work. 6 weeks later, following a separate research thread entirely, she was working through a collection of personal testimony transcripts held at the American Battle Monuments Commission archive on accounts gathered from veterans of the Italian campaign in the 1970s as part of an oral history project that had been partially funded and then partially defunded, and had ended with a significant portion of its collected material uncatalogued and unread. The transcript of James Reedy's account was in that uncatalogued portion. She almost missed it. It was filed under a reference number that corresponded to a different veteran's name, a cataloging error that had kept it effectively invisible for 16 years. She found it because she was thorough, and because thoroughness in archive work means reading things that are not necessarily what you came to find. She read Reedy's transcript once, quickly, and then she stopped. She went back to her bag and found the photographs she had taken in Munich 6 weeks earlier, and she placed Schramm's account beside Reedy's transcript on the archive table, and she read them together, slowly, moving between them. And the room around her went very quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something in them has changed. The overlapping details were not vague. They were not the general overlaps that can be attributed to the common grammar of military reporting or the shared visual vocabulary of men who had been trained to describe terrain and conditions in similar ways. They were specific in a manner that foreclosed coincidence as a comfortable explanation. Both accounts described 4 figures, not 3, not 5. 4, moving in single file. Both accounts described hooded robes, long, dark, with the hoods drawn forward. And both accounts described movement that was slow, deliberate, and completely upright, with no adjustment for the terrain beneath the figures. Both accounts described the figures moving against or without reference to the prevailing wind conditions, with no visible effect of wind on the robes. Both accounts described the absence of shadows in conditions of strong moonlight on pale stone ground, where every other object was casting a clearly defined shadow. And both accounts, written in different languages by men who served on opposite sides of the battle line and could not by any means have communicated with each other, used a strikingly similar phrase to describe the quality of the figure's movement. Schramm had written, in German, that they moved as though the ground were an extension of their intention. Reedy had said in English that they walked like men who had done it so many times the ground itself knew them. Dr. Ferretti sat with those 2 phrases for a long time. She published her findings the following year in a paper that was careful, precise, and deliberately restrained in its conclusions, presenting the documentary evidence and the overlapping details and declining to offer any interpretation beyond the factual observation that 2 independent accounts, separated by language and time and opposing military allegiances, describe the same event with a specificity that the standard explanations did not adequately address. The reception was exactly what she had anticipated. Her academic colleagues were polite and unconvinced. The military history community largely ignored the paper. 2 paranormal publications ran pieces on it that she found embarrassing in their enthusiasm and their indifference to the precision of her actual findings. Then a letter arrived from Bavaria. A man who said he was Brandt, the young soldier who had been with Schramm that night in the courtyard, confirmed every detail in the report, adding only that he had never spoken of it in the 44 years since it happened because he had never found anyone he thought would understand what he was describing. She wrote back to him immediately. I understand. I have read the other account. There was a long pause in the correspondence before his reply arrived. Then you know that there is no explanation that covers everything. Someone should say that clearly. Someone should simply say it and let it stand. Dr. Ferretti kept that letter. She kept it because it said the thing that her academic training had prevented her from saying in print, the thing that the evidence, assembled honestly and without pressure toward any conclusion, had been pointing toward from the beginning. There is no explanation that covers everything. But before accepting that conclusion, one final possibility deserves its full and honest examination. Because there were monks at Monte Cassino, real ones, living ones, and that fact must be placed on the table before anything else is said. When the German military occupied the Monte Cassino area in the autumn of 1943 and began constructing the defensive fortifications of the Winter Line, the abbey was still inhabited. Abbot Gregorio Diamare, an elderly man in his late 70s who had led the Benedictine community at Monte Cassino for decades, refused to abandon the monastery despite the battle that was building around it. He negotiated directly with German commanders, specifically with General Fridolin von Zenger und Ederlin, to have the abbey's most precious religious artifacts and manuscripts evacuated to the Vatican before the fighting reached the building itself. Those negotiations were conducted with the particular quiet authority of a man who understood that he was the custodian of 14 centuries of history and intended to remain so regardless of what the armies around him chose to do. A small community of monks remained with him. The exact number varies depending on the source, but the accounts consistently describe a group of between 6 and 15 monks who stayed inside the abbey walls through the autumn and winter of 1943, continuing their daily offices, their prayers, their rituals, maintaining as much of the rhythm of Benedictine life as the circumstances of an active war zone allowed. Their habit, the garment that Benedictine monks have worn in essentially the same form since the 6th century, is a long robe of black wool, floor-length, with a hood that can be drawn forward over the face. It is belted at the waist with a leather strap. It is, in every particular of its appearance, exactly what Schramm described in his report from the autumn of 1943, and exactly what Reedy described seeing from the lower slopes of the Casino Hill on the night of February 15, 1944. This is the rational explanation, and it is not nothing. A small group of monks conducting a nighttime ritual or prayer procession through the abbey grounds, moving in the slow and practiced single file of men who have processed the same route together hundreds of times, would look from a distance of 30 feet in a dark courtyard, or from the lower slopes of a hill in firelight and moonlight, almost exactly as both men described. When Dr. Ferretti raised this possibility in her paper, she noted it carefully and gave it the weight it deserved. She also noted what it did not explain. She put the question directly in her published findings with the restraint of a woman who had spent her career being careful with words. The presence of living monks in the abbey during this period is documented and cannot be dismissed. What the documented presence of living monks does not account for is the specific and independently recorded detail of the absent shadows, which appears in both accounts with identical precision and which no rational explanation currently available has adequately addressed. A colleague who read the paper before publication asked her over coffee in Rome whether she believed the rational explanation covered it. She was quiet for a moment. I believe it covers most of it, and most of it is not the same as all of it. And in this particular case, the part it does not cover is the only part that matters. Her colleague looked at her over his coffee cup. You think they were something else? I think that a place where men have prayed and died and been buried for 1,400 years, a place that has been destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again, a place that was reduced to rubble on the morning of February 15, 1944, is the kind of place where the boundary between what is living and what is not living may not observe the same rules that apply elsewhere. I think the monks of Monte Cassino never fully left. Not all of them. Not the ones who had been there the longest. Her colleague said nothing for a moment. Then he said the thing that people say when an explanation frightens them more than the absence of one. That is not a conclusion you can put in an academic paper. No, it is not. But it is the conclusion the evidence points to when you follow it all the way to the end without stopping at the comfortable part. The Benedictine order returned to Monte Cassino after the war. The abbey was rebuilt, consecrated again in 1964, and has been continuously inhabited by a monastic community ever since. The monks there today wear the same long black hooded robes that Benedict of Nursia prescribed for his order in the 6th century. The same robes that Schramm described. The same robes that Reedy described. The same robes that have been worn on that hill through every destruction and every rebuilding for 1400 years. Whether the figures that two soldiers on opposite sides of a war saw moving through the moonlit ruins were among the living monks who remained. Or whether they were something older, something that the destruction of the abbey had disturbed or released, or simply made visible for the first time, is a question that the archive cannot answer. What the archive can tell you is that they were there, that two men recorded them with identical precision, and that in full moonlight, on pale stone ground, they cast no shadow. The ground beneath Monte Cassino holds the dead of 14 centuries. Standing on that hill and understanding what is buried beneath it, it is not difficult to believe that some of them never entirely agreed to stay down. Both men who witnessed what walked that hill that night came home. What they brought back with them, and what they eventually gave away before they died, is the final part of this story. Dieter Schramm survived the war. He was captured by American forces in the spring of 1945 during the final collapse of the German line in northern Italy, which carries its own quiet irony given what he had witnessed on an Italian hillside 18 months earlier. He spent 8 months in a prisoner of war camp in England before being repatriated to Bavaria in early 1946. He returned to the town he had grown up in, married a woman he had known before the war, and spent the next 30 years teaching history and geography to children in a secondary school 20 kilometers from where he was born. He was, by every account of the people who knew him in those years, a good teacher. Patient, precise, genuinely interested in his students. Like the kind of man who remembered which children struggled with which subjects and adjusted without making the adjustment obvious, because he understood that a person's dignity and their ability to learn are not separate things. He never returned to Italy. His former students, interviewed by a German journalist who followed up on Dr. Ferretti's paper in 1989, remembered him as a calm and steady presence. One of them, a woman who had been in his history class in the early 1960s, remembered something specific that she had not thought about in years until the journalist's questions brought it back. He told us once that the most important thing history teaches you is humility. He said that every age believes it understands the world completely, and every age is wrong about something fundamental. And the honest thing is to hold your understanding loosely because the world contains things that your current categories cannot process. She paused before adding one final detail. We were 15. We thought he was talking about politics. Schramm died in 1991 at the age of 79. Among the papers his family found after his death was a single handwritten page that his daughter brought to the attention of Dr. Ferretti after reading the 1989 newspaper piece. It was not dated. It was not addressed to anyone. It was written in the careful, deliberate handwriting of a man choosing his words slowly. It said in German that he had seen something on a hill in Italy in 1943 that he had never found a category for, and that he had made his peace with not finding one. And when that the longer he lived, the more he believed that the honest response to certain things was not explanation, but acknowledgement. He wrote, "Some things ask only to be witnessed. They do not ask to be understood." James Reedy survived the Rapido River crossing. He was pulled from the riverbank by a medic in the early hours of February 16th, suffering from exposure and a shrapnel wound to his left shoulder that required 3 weeks of treatment in a field hospital near Naples. He returned to his unit in March 1944 and finished the Italian campaign and came home to Texas in the autumn of 1945. He worked for 30 years as a high school football coach in a small town outside San Antonio. He raised 3 children, He went to church every Sunday, without exception, for the rest of his life, which his family noted was not something he had done with any particular consistency before the war. He told his story once, in 1971, to the person sitting beside his hospital bed. And when he finished telling it, he was quiet for a while, and then said something the person beside him wrote down immediately because the phrasing was specific enough to want to preserve. Some things just want a witness. They don't need you to understand them. They just need you to have been there and to not look away. Dr. Ferretti, when she read both men's words side by side, sat with them for a long time. Schramm in German, Reedy in English. Two men who never met, who fought on opposite sides of the same war, who saw the same thing on the same hill and carried it home in silence for decades. Some things ask only to be witnessed, and some things just want a witness. She had been collecting military records for 20 years. She had never encountered anything like it, and she said so once to the colleague who asked what she made of it all after the paper was published and the small storm of attention had died down. Two men, different languages, different sides, same hill, same night, same figures, same shadows that were not there. And then, 40 years apart, without any possibility of comparison, the same sentence. Her colleague waited. "What does that tell you?" She looked at him for a moment before she answered. "It tells me that whatever was on that hill, it left the same mark on both of them, and that the mark it left was not fear. It was something quieter than fear, something that stayed." There is a theory, taken seriously by researchers who study places of extreme historical trauma, that locations where intense human experience has accumulated over long periods of time can retain something of what happened within them, not as memory exactly, but as a kind of residue, an imprint left by centuries of prayer and violence and death and devotion, that does not simply vanish when the building that contained it is reduced to rubble. Monte Cassino had been accumulating that residue for 1,400 years. What the bombing of February 15th, 1944 may have done is not destroyed it, but disturbed it. The way demolishing the walls of a room does not destroy what was inside the room, but releases it into the open air. And then there is the simpler explanation. A small group of Benedictine monks, documented and present, conducting a nighttime procession through the ruins of their destroyed home, moving in the slow single file of men whose entire lives had been built around ritual and repetition. Two soldiers on opposite sides of a battle line, operating under extreme stress, seeing something real and interpreting it through the lens of fear and exhaustion and the particular vulnerability of a mind that has been pushed to its limit. That explanation is available. It is reasonable. It covers most of what both men described. It does not cover the shadows. In full moonlight, on pale stone ground, when every broken wall and every piece of rubble and every living man on that hill cast a hard, clean shadow behind him, 4 figures in hooded robes walked through the ruins of Monte Cassino and left nothing on the ground beneath them. Not a trace. Not a darkness. Nothing at all. Schramm recorded it in 1943. Reedy described it in 1971. Neither man ever found an explanation that satisfied him, and neither man ever stopped thinking about it. They did not ask for an explanation in the end. They asked for something smaller and harder, and in its own way, more demanding. Some things ask only to be witnessed. Some things just want a witness. Now you have been one. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and come back. There are more accounts like this one, from men and women who were in places the maps marked clearly, but whose full contents no map has ever recorded. Every one of those stories deserves exactly what Schramm and Reedy asked for. Someone to witness it, someone to not look away. We will see you in the next one.